Margaret Harper had always believed in the power of education.
She had spent over 4 decades teaching literature to high school students, devoting herself to the idea that one spark of curiosity could light a fire in someone's life. Yet, in her quieter moments, she sometimes wondered if her efforts had really made any difference at all. Retirement had brought a sense of peace, yet it was tinged with the faintest hint of regret, a lingering question about her legacy that she had no way of answering. The day had begun just like any other.
Margaret stepped out onto her back porch, her fingers brushing against the leaves of her potted plants as she moved to water her small garden. The early morning light bathed her cottage in a soft golden hue, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was cool, carrying with it the scent of dew on grass, and Margaret found comfort in this simple routine.
As she poured water over the soil, her eyes drifted to the mailbox near the gate.
The postal carrier had already come and gone, leaving behind a small stack of envelopes. Margaret set down her watering can, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her way to the mailbox.
Bills, a flyer for a new grocery store, and tucked in the middle, an unfamiliar envelope with thick, cream-colored paper caught her eye.
The handwriting was cursive, elegant, and she paused for a moment, turning the letter over.
The return address indicated it had come from across the country, and the stamp suggested it had traveled quite a distance to reach her. Intrigued, Margaret went back inside, settling into her favorite armchair by the window.
She slipped a finger under the envelope flap and opened it carefully.
As she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanned the first few lines.
It was a letter from Alex Whitman, one of her former students. The name brought back a flood of memories. Alex, the quiet, intense boy who sat in the back row, always watching her intently during her lessons. Margaret's heart swelled as she read his words. Alex was writing to thank her.
He spoke of how her class had changed his life, how one of her lessons had planted a seed that had since grown into something incredible. He wrote about his journey, his successes, and how he owed it all to a moment. He could never forget a moment she had provided.
Margaret lowered the letter, her eyes misting over as she reread the lines. She could barely remember the specific lesson he mentioned, but the thought that something she had said had such a profound impact moved her.
She found herself wondering about Alex's life since high school, about the man he had become.
What had she taught him that had resonated so deeply? She had to know more. She stood, her tea now cold beside her, and moved toward the bookshelf in the corner of her living room. On the bottom shelf, tucked away behind gardening guides and old cookbooks, were her yearbooks, every single one from her 40 years of teaching. Margaret knelt, pulling out the thick volumes, dust gathering on her fingertips as she laid them out on her coffee table. She flipped through them carefully, searching for Alex's face. Finally, she found it, a black and white photograph, slightly grainy. Alex Whitman, a young man with dark hair and a serious expression. She touched the image lightly, smiling at the memory.
He had always been bright, always determined.
She remembered how he stayed behind after class sometimes, how he would ask questions that hinted at a mind far beyond his years, a hunger for knowledge that went deeper than the surface-level interest of other students. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden idea. She could call Nancy. Nancy was her closest friend among her colleagues, someone who had taught alongside her for nearly 30 years.
If anyone knew what had become of Alex, it would be Nancy.
She picked up the phone, dialing Nancy's number from memory. The familiar tone rang a few times before her friend's warm voice came through on the other end. Margaret.
"It's been too long," Nancy exclaimed, and they spent a few minutes catching up, exchanging stories of retirement, and the small joys that filled their days. Eventually, Margaret brought up the reason for her call.
Nancy, do you remember Alex Whitman? He was in my class back in, I think it was 2005 or 2006.
I just got a letter from him, and I'm curious, do you know what happened to him after school?
There was a brief silence as Nancy thought. Alex Whitman.
Oh, yes.
I do remember him. Bright kid.
I think he ended up doing quite well for himself. Something in tech, I believe. I heard he started a company not too long ago. He's doing very well.
I remember someone mentioning he was involved in some big charity events. He always had that determination, didn't he? Margaret nodded, even though Nancy couldn't see her.
Yes, he did, she murmured. Hearing this only deepened her curiosity. Do you know where I could find more about what he's doing now?
Not exactly, Nancy replied, her voice thoughtful. But I heard there's a charity gala coming up soon. Someone mentioned he was hosting it. You could look into that. It might be a good place to start.
After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat back, her eyes drifting to the yearbook still open in her lap. The idea of attending a gala seemed daunting, especially at her age, and after so many years of quiet solitude.
But the urge to understand the impact she had on Alex's life was too strong to ignore.
She wanted to see with her own eyes what had become of the young boy she once taught.
She moved to her study, turning on her old desktop computer, waiting as it slowly hummed to life. The internet was something she used sparingly, but now it became a gateway to her curiosity.
She typed in Alex's name, and soon enough, articles began to appear on the screen.
Pictures of Alex at tech conferences, smiling beside prominent figures, his name mentioned alongside stories of philanthropy and success. Margaret stared at the images. The young man she remembered had grown into someone confident, someone whose presence commanded a room. He wore tailored suits and a watch that likely cost more than her car. It was almost surreal seeing the person Alex had become felt like stepping into an alternate reality.
One article caught her eye. It was about a charity gala happening soon in the city, hosted by none other than Alex Whitman. Margaret's fingers hovered over the mouse, her heart pounding slightly as she read the details. A part of her hesitated. Did she really want to step into this world, a world that seemed so different from her own? But then she remembered the letter, the words Alex had written, and she felt something stir within her, a determination, a need to see the outcome of the seeds she had planted all those years ago. That night, as Margaret prepared dinner, her thoughts remained on Alex.
The kitchen was filled with the sound of sizzling onions, the rich scent of spices hanging in the air, yet she was only half present, her mind elsewhere.
She needed closure not just for herself, but for the legacy she had always questioned.
She wanted to know, truly know, if her teachings had made a difference, or if they had somehow led Alex astray. With a deep breath, she made up her mind. She would go to the gala. She would see Alex again, not just through articles or photographs, but in person. And maybe, just maybe, she would find the answers she had been seeking all these years. The grand entrance to the charity gala was nothing like anything Margaret had ever experienced. The towering, ornate doors seemed to dwarf her as she stepped into the bustling venue.
Lights twinkled from an enormous chandelier, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow.
The sounds of chatter, laughter, and the gentle clink of glasses enveloped her in a cacophony that was almost overwhelming.
For a moment, she hesitated just beyond the entrance, her heart pounding with both excitement and uncertainty.
She adjusted her old but elegant dress, a gown she hadn't worn in years, and took a deep breath.
Guests moved fluidly through the space. champagne flutes in hand, dressed in the sort of attire Margaret only saw in magazines.
She felt out of place amidst the opulence, but kept reminding herself of why she was there. This was not about her comfort. It was about Alex and the answers she sought. She clutched her small purse, inside of which was her notebook from her teaching days, the one she hoped might serve as a bridge to their shared past. Margaret's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Alex. She took in the vast expanse of the ballroom, the high ceilings, the artfully arranged tables, and the servers moving gracefully, balancing trays of appetizers. Finally, across the room, she spotted him. Alex stood among a small group of people, tall and confident, his dark hair perfectly styled. He wore a tailored tuxedo, and even from a distance, Margaret could see the warmth of his smile as he engaged with his guests. She watched him for a moment, noting the way he gestured as he spoke, commanding the attention of those around him.
It was so different from the quiet, introspective student she remembered. There was an ease to his movements now, a self-assuredness that spoke of years spent navigating this world of wealth and power.
Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly. Should she approach him now, or wait for a better moment?
As she hesitated, an assistant dressed in all black with a polished earpiece approached her. "Ma'am, can I help you with anything?"
The young woman asked, her tone polite but businesslike. Margaret blinked, startled.
"Oh, yes.
"I am here to see Alex Whitman. He was my student," she added, almost apologetically, as if that connection might not be enough to warrant her presence here. The assistant gave her a curious look, then nodded.
"Let me see if Mr. Whitman is available."
She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Margaret standing alone near the entrance.
She felt eyes on her, whether real or imagined, and she fidgeted, hoping she didn't look too out of place.
It wasn't long before she saw Alex turning in her direction, his face lighting up in recognition.
He excused himself from the group and made his way toward her, his steps quickening as he neared. "Mrs. Harper," he called, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd.
Margaret smiled, relief washing over her as he approached.
"Alex," she said warmly.
He looked every bit the successful entrepreneur, but when he smiled at her, she saw the same young boy she'd once known, the same curiosity in his eyes.
He took her hands in his, leaning in to give her a gentle hug. "I can't believe you're here."
"This is amazing," he said, his smile genuine. "You look wonderful," Margaret laughed softly.
"I'm not sure I quite fit in with all of this," she said, gesturing to the grand surroundings.
"Nonsense," Alex replied, his tone filled with warmth. "You're the most important guest here tonight." He turned slightly, waving at a few of the people he'd been talking to.
"I was just telling some colleagues about you, about the teacher who changed everything for me."
Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. "That's very kind of you, Alex," she said, though a part of her felt a sense of unease. It was strange to be so publicly recognized, to be a piece of someone's narrative when she barely remembered the moment he spoke of. The pride she felt was tempered by an inexplicable undercurrent of discomfort. Alex led her further into the room, introducing her briefly to a few of his associates, each of whom greeted her warmly, congratulating her on her impact on Alex's life. Margaret nodded politely, smiling as she listened, though she felt herself growing increasingly out of place. After a while, Alex turned to her, his smile softening.
"Why don't we go somewhere a little quieter? I'd love to catch up properly." He led her to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the crowd.
They found a pair of plush chairs, and as they sat, Alex turned his full attention to her.
"It's been so long," he said, his voice softening. I can't tell you how much your letter meant to me.
I was so happy to hear from you. Margaret smiled. I was moved by your letter, Alex. I wanted to see for myself how you were doing. It sounds like you've built something truly remarkable. Alex nodded, his eyes brightening.
It's been an incredible journey.
I've been so fortunate, and I owe so much of it to what you taught me. He paused, his expression thoughtful.
You know, it was your lesson on resilience, about never giving up, about pushing through obstacles that really stayed with me.
I've built my entire business around that idea. Margaret felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite place pride. Yes, but also a hint of unease.
I'm glad to hear that, she said slowly.
But tell me, Alex, what kind of business are you running? I've read some articles, but I'd love to hear it in your own words. Alex leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at his lips.
It's a tech startup, mostly focused on optimization solutions for various industries.
We help companies streamline their processes, cut costs, and maximize their efficiency. He paused, his eyes searching hers. I've always believed that success comes from being unrelenting, from finding every possible edge. That's something I got from you. Margaret nodded, but her unease deepened.
There was something in his tone, a sharpness, a drive that seemed almost ruthless.
And how do you balance that drive, Alex? The need for success and, well, the importance of doing good.
Alex's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered.
It's all part of the game, isn't it? Sometimes you have to make tough decisions.
But I always try to give back, to support the community.
We've got a charitable arm, and we do a lot of work with local organizations. He leaned forward, his smile widening again. In fact, I'd love for you to be involved, Mrs. Harper.
I could make a donation in your name, whatever cause you support.
Margaret forced a smile, her heart sinking slightly. The more Alex spoke, the more she sensed a dissonance between his words and the value she had tried to instill in her students. He was successful, yes, but at what cost?
Was this really what she had taught him?
That's very generous of you, Alex, she said quietly.
I'd have to think about it.
Alex's phone buzzed on the table beside him, and he glanced at it, his expression shifting slightly.
I should get back, he said, standing.
He took Margaret's hands in his again. But let's stay in touch.
I'd love for you to see more of what we're doing.
Maybe we could meet again soon? Margaret nodded, though a sense of heaviness settled in her chest.
Of course, she replied.
As Alex disappeared back into the crowd, Margaret remained seated, her thoughts racing.
She had come here seeking closure, hoping to understand her impact, but instead, she felt a growing concern. Had her teachings been misunderstood?
Had she, in her attempt to inspire resilience, inadvertently encouraged a kind of ambition that disregarded ethics? The grandeur of the gala seemed to fade around her, and she suddenly felt very small. She had always believed in the power of education, but now, faced with the unintended consequences of her influence, she couldn't help but wonder had she done more harm than good. Margaret rose from her seat, her eyes scanning the room one last time for Alex.
He was deep in conversation, laughing easily with his colleagues. She turned and made her way to the exit, her heart heavy with the questions that now filled her mind.
The night air was cool as she stepped outside, and she took a deep breath, her thoughts turning to what she might do next. She couldn't just leave things as they were, she had to understand. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could still make a difference in Alex's life before it was too late.
The drive home from the gala was quiet,
But Margaret's mind was far from settled. The city lights blurred into streaks of color as she stared out of the taxi window, her thoughts on Alex, his words, and the sense of disconnect she felt between what she had once tried to teach and what Alex had taken from it. By the time she arrived at her cottage, a knot of unease had formed in her chest.
As she unlocked her front door and stepped inside, the familiar comfort of her cozy home offered little solace.
Margaret sat down at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The conversation with Alex replayed over and over in her mind, his confident smile, his offer to donate in her name, and his justifications.
She had wanted to feel proud, to be able to tell herself that she had helped a young man rise above his circumstances and achieve greatness. But now, she was left wondering if the lessons she had imparted had been distorted, taken to an extreme she never intended. Margaret rose from her chair, moving into her small study. She switched on her desk lamp, its soft light illuminating the stacks of books and papers that had accumulated there over the years. She needed to understand more about Alex's business, needed to see if her growing suspicion about his methods was justified. She turned on her computer, the old machine humming to life slowly. She typed in Alex's name, searching for articles, news, anything that might give her a clearer picture.
The headlines were largely positive, praising his achievements, highlighting his generosity and philanthropy, but Margaret knew enough to read between the lines.
There were mentions of controversy, disputes that had been brushed aside.
She clicked on one article that hinted at questionable business practices methods Alex's company had used to acquire land for a new development project. The author had noted the significant pushback from the local community, but it had ultimately been unsuccessful.
The article suggested that pressure had been applied, that the opposition had been silenced in ways that weren't entirely above board.
Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she read.
This wasn't the kind of success she had envisioned for Alex.
She remembered him as the young boy who had stayed after class, asking her questions about literature, about life, about how to find meaning in the world.
She had wanted to help him understand resilience, the importance of standing up against adversity, not to encourage the kind of ambition that trampled others in the pursuit of personal gain.
The next morning, Margaret decided she needed a different perspective. She picked up her phone and called a few of her former students, those she remembered as being friends with Alex during high school. The conversations were mixed.
Some of them spoke highly of Alex, noting his rise in the business world as something inspirational, proof that anyone could make it if they tried hard enough. But others were more hesitant.
One former student, Emily, mentioned that she had worked with a non-profit that had clashed with Alex's company.
She spoke of how disillusioned she had felt when she realized Alex wasn't the person she remembered from school. "It's like he's lost touch with the things that used to matter to him," Emily said. Back then, he cared about fairness, about people.
Now, it's all about the bottom line. Margaret thanked Emily for her time, her heart heavy as she hung up the phone.
She realized she needed to go back to the beginning, to the place where she had first known Alex, where she had taught him those lessons that seemed to have been twisted into something else entirely.
Later that afternoon, Margaret drove to the high school where she had taught for so many years. The building looked much the same as it always had, though there were a few new additions, a fresh coat of paint, a new wing added to the far side. She walked through the halls, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors. She passed by classrooms, catching glimpses of teachers at work, students engaged in lessons. It felt both familiar and distant, like stepping into a memory. Margaret eventually made her way to her old classroom.
The room had been repurposed, but she could still picture the rows of desks, the posters she had hung on the walls, the chalkboard where she had written the words she hoped would inspire young minds.
She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling Alex as he had been a young boy with a hunger for knowledge, a seriousness that had set him apart from his peers. The current teacher, a young woman named Miss
Lopez found Margaret standing in the doorway and invited her in. They spoke briefly with Miss Lopez, expressing her admiration for Margaret's long career and the legacy she had left behind.
Margaret appreciated the kind words, but her mind was elsewhere, trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. She returned home with a sense of determination. She could no longer ignore what she had learned.
The feeling of responsibility weighed heavily on her, and she knew she needed to confront Alex again. She needed to understand if she had truly played a part in leading him down this path, and if so, whether she could guide him back to something more ethical, more meaningful.
That evening, Margaret called Nancy. She explained everything she had discovered, her fears about the direction Alex had taken, and her sense of responsibility for what he had become.
Nancy listened, her voice filled with concern when she finally spoke.
"Margaret, are you sure you want to get involved in this?" Nancy asked gently. "Alex is powerful now. Challenging him could bring a lot of trouble. You've done your part as a teacher. Maybe this isn't something you need to take on." Margaret sighed, her eyes drifting to the notebook on her desk, the one filled with the hopes and dreams of her students, including Alex's essay about his aspirations.
"I can't just walk away, Nancy," she said quietly. "I feel like I owe it to him, to myself.
If I had a hand in this, then I need to try to make it right."
Nancy paused, then spoke softly.
"Just promise me you'll be careful, okay?"
"I know you're doing this for the right reasons, but Alex isn't the same person we knew back then."
Margaret promised, though a part of her knew that there was no easy way forward.
She hung up the phone and turned to the notebook, flipping through the pages until she found Alex's essay. She read his words, the dreams of a young boy who wanted to make a difference, who wanted to help his mother and give back to the community that had supported him.
The sincerity in those words struck her deeply, and she felt tears prick at her eyes.
She couldn't let those dreams be last to ambition and ruthlessness.
She had to try, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths about herself, about her influence, and about the unintended consequences of the lessons she had once taught. Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least try to make things right. With a deep breath, she closed the notebook and reached for her phone. She needed to contact Alex to arrange another meeting. This time, it wouldn't be about pleasantries or polite conversation.
She needed to confront him, to understand the choices he had made, and to see if there was still a way to guide him back to the person he had once aspired to be.
The stakes were too high, not just for Alex, but for the legacy Margaret had spent her life building, one rooted in hope, integrity, and the belief that education could make a positive difference. Margaret stood in front of the sleek high-rise that housed Alex's corporate office, feeling dwarfed by its sheer size. The gloss facade shimmered in the sunlight, and as she looked up, she could see her own reflection, a small figure among the grandeur.
She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked through the revolving doors into the cool, polished lobby. The space was minimalist and modern, filled with soft ambient music and the hum of people moving with purpose. She approached the reception desk, her palms feeling slightly clammy.
"I'm here to see Alex Whitman," she said, her voice steady, even though her heart felt anything but calm. The receptionist looked up, nodded, and made a quick call. Moments later, Margaret was escorted to the elevator, the receptionist's polite smile doing little to ease her nerves.
The elevator ride felt endless as she ascended floor after floor, each ding marking her ascent into Alex's world, a world that seemed so far removed from the high school classroom where they had first met. The door opened with a soft chime, and she stepped out onto a floor bathed in natural light, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the sprawling city below. A young assistant greeted her at the door to Alex's office and ushered her in. The office was vast, with sleek furniture, abstract art adorning the walls, and a commanding view of the skyline. Alex stood up from behind his desk, his smile wide, but there was something guarded in his eyes as he approached her.
"Mrs. Harper," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I wasn't expecting you so soon. What a pleasant surprise." Margaret took his hand, noting the strength in his grip. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Alex," she said, her eyes meeting his. She could see the layers behind his composed expression, the curiosity, the cautiousness.
"I wanted to speak with you, in more depth, about some of the things I've been thinking about since the gala." Alex gestured for her to sit in one of the plush chairs by the window, taking the seat opposite her. He leaned back, his eyes never leaving her face.
"Of course. What's on your mind?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully.
"Alex, I've been doing some reading about your business."
"I saw the headlines, the articles."
"I couldn't help but notice that there have been some controversies."
"Issues with land acquisition, community disputes, things that don't quite align with the values I thought I had instilled in my students."
Alex's expression hardened slightly, though he kept his smile. He crossed his legs, his demeanor remaining polite, but she could sense the tension beneath his calm exterior. "You know, Mrs. Harper, business isn't always as clean as we'd like it to be. There are tough decisions, compromises that have to be made for the greater good."
Margaret frowned, leaning forward.
"But at what cost, Alex?"
"I remember you as someone who cared deeply about people, about doing what was right. I wanted my students to be resilient, yes, but also compassionate."
"I fear that somewhere along the way, those lessons were lost or perhaps misinterpreted." Alex's smile faded entirely now, replaced by a more guarded expression. He sighed, glancing out the window before turning his gaze back to her.
"Mrs. Harper, I know you meant well, and I owe a lot to you. But the world I operate in, it's not the classroom. It's not about ideals, it's about survival."
"If I hadn't made those tough calls, someone else would have, and I'd have been left behind. Sometimes you have to do what's necessary."
Margaret's heart ached at his words. She could see the determination in his eyes, the belief that his choices were justified.
But she could also see the boy she had once known, the one who had wanted to help his mother, who had wanted to make the world a better place. She couldn't reconcile the two images in her mind, and it pained her to think that perhaps she had played a part in creating this version of Alex. "Alex," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness, "success doesn't have to come at the cost of others."
You were always capable of achieving great things, but there's a difference between ambition and ruthlessness.
"The impact we have on others, it matters. It's what gives our success meaning." Alex looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, but he didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice low and measured.
"I think you might be misunderstanding the realities of my world. It's not about being ruthless for the sake of it. It's about staying ahead, about making sure I can keep doing what I do on my terms.
Margaret shook her head, her eyes never leaving his.
But at whose expense, Alex? I've read about the communities that were hurt by your projects.
These are real people, real lives that were affected by those decisions. It's not enough to just succeed. It matters how we get there.
Alex's jaw tightened, and he stood up abruptly, moving toward the window, his back to her.
You don't understand, Mrs. Harper.
You've never had to make those kinds of decisions, to carry that kind of responsibility. It's easy to sit on the sidelines and judge.
Margaret felt her heart sink.
She rose slowly, her voice gentle but firm. I'm not judging you, Alex. I'm trying to understand. And I want you to understand too that the choices you make, the compromises, they don't just affect your bottom line. They ripple outwards, touching lives in ways you might not realize. You wanted to change the world, and you still can, but not like this.
Alex turned to face her, his expression conflicted.
He was silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice softer.
You really think I've lost my way, don't you?
Margaret stepped closer, her eyes filled with compassion. I think you're doing what you think is best, but I also think you've forgotten some of the reasons why you started in the first place.
I just want you to consider that there might be a different path, one that doesn't require stepping over others to reach the top. There was a long silence, and then Alex nodded, though his expression remained guarded.
I'll think about what you've said, Mrs. Harper.
I can't promise anything, but I'll think about it. Margaret gave him a small, sad smile.
That's all I ask, Alex. She paused, then added, You've always been capable of greatness.
I just want to see you achieve it in a way that you can be proud of, not just today, but years from now. Alex looked at her, and for a moment, Margaret thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that hinted at the young boy she had once taught.
He nodded again, his voice almost a whisper. Thank you, Mrs. Harper. Margaret nodded, a sense of both hope and sadness washing over her.
She turned and walked toward the door, pausing briefly before leaving.
I hope you find your way, Alex, she said softly, and then she was gone, the door closing gently behind her.
As Margaret stepped back into the elevator, she felt the weight of the conversation settle over her. She had done what she could, planted a seed, just as she had all those years ago. Whether it would grow into something meaningful was now up to Alex. She hoped with all her heart that he would find the courage to change course, to remember the values she had tried to instill in him.
And as the elevator descended, she realized that this, too, was part of her journey, accepting that her influence had limits, and that ultimately, the choice lay with Alex. Margaret returned to her cottage feeling both drained and determined. The conversation with Alex had left her with a heavy heart, yet there was a glimmer of hope that perhaps she had reached some part of him.
She needed guidance, someone who could help her think through what to do next.
Without much hesitation, she picked up the phone and called Nancy. Nancy answered almost immediately, her voice warm and familiar.
After exchanging pleasantries, Margaret explained the meeting with Alex, her fears, and the ultimatum she had given him. Nancy listened without interrupting, and when Margaret finally paused, Nancy sighed. Oh, Margaret, Nancy said softly, I know you feel responsible, but you're up against something much bigger here.
Alex is powerful, and confronting him like this might not just be difficult, it could be dangerous. You've always had such a big heart, but this isn't something you need to take on alone. Margaret knew Nancy was right, but she also knew that walking away was not an option.
She had dedicated her life to teaching, to guiding young minds to understand the impact they could have on the world. The idea that her own lessons had been twisted into justifying harm was something she could not accept without trying to make it right.
I understand, Nancy, Margaret replied.
But I feel like I have to do this.
If I don't, I'll always wonder if there was something more I could have done.
It's not just about Alex, it's about all the students I've taught over the years, the lessons I've shared.
I need to believe that those lessons mattered in a positive way.
Nancy paused, then spoke again, her voice filled with concern.
If you're determined, just promise me you'll be careful.
Maybe there's another way to reach him. Maybe.
You could get others involved. Margaret thought about that.
She wasn't alone. There were others who knew Alex, who had seen his transformation over the years. Perhaps they could help her make Alex see that there was still time to change course.
The next morning, Margaret sat at her desk, leafing through old notebooks, searching for a particular essay that Alex had written during his senior year. She remembered it vividly, an essay about his dreams, about wanting to build a company that would help others.
When she finally found it, she read his words, feeling a pang of nostalgia.
The young Alex had been idealistic, driven by a desire to make a difference.
Somewhere along the way, that drive had been corrupted by the trappings of success.
Margaret decided to take a bold step. She reached out to a journalist friend, someone she trusted to handle the story with care.
She explained her situation, her concerns about Alex's business practices, and the way his rise had impacted others negatively. Her friend listened, intrigued, and promised to look into it. Margaret knew that going public was a risky move, but she also believed it was a necessary one.
Maybe the pressure from the media would force Alex to reflect on his actions, to see the consequences of his choices.
Later that evening, Margaret received a call from Alex. His voice was tense, barely masking his anger.
Mrs. Harper, he began, his tone cold. I hear you've been talking to people stirring things up. Do you have any idea what you're doing? Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself.
Alex, I am trying to help you see what you're missing. I care about you, about the kind of man you are becoming.
This isn't the path you wanted for yourself, I know it. Alex was silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice tinged with frustration.
You think you understand my world, but you don't. You don't know what it takes to stay on top, to keep things moving forward.
Margaret's heart ached at his words. She wished she could make him see that success didn't have to mean sacrificing one's morals. Alex, I understand that the world can be harsh, but you have a choice. You've always had a choice.
The impact you have on others, on the communities you touch, it matters. I know there's still a part of you that cares.
There was a pause, and for a brief moment, Margaret thought she heard something in his voice soften.
But then he spoke again, his tone firm.
I need to go, Mrs. Harper.
I would appreciate it if you'd leave my business alone.
I don't want to see you get hurt. Margaret knew he was warning her, but she also knew that the Alex she remembered was still in there, buried beneath layers of ambition and defensiveness. I'm not trying to hurt you, Alex.
I'm just trying to help you remember who you are.
The line went silent, and Margaret was left alone in her study, her heart heavy. She had taken a risk, and now she would have to wait to see what came of it. Days passed, and Margaret tried to carry on with her life as normally as possible.
She tended to her garden, attended her book club meetings, but always, at the back of her mind, she thought of Alex, wondering if anything she had said had reached him.
One evening, just as the sun was setting, there was a knock at her door. Margaret opened it to find Alex standing there, his expression a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, something that looked almost like vulnerability.
"Alex," Margaret said, surprised.
"What are you doing here?"
Alex stepped inside, his shoulders tense.
He looked around her cozy cottage, his gaze lingering on the books, the plants, the photographs of her past students that adorned the shelves.
He took a deep breath, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I've been thinking about what you said, about what I used to want to do.
I came here because
I don't know if I'm doing the right thing anymore."
Margaret's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "It's never too late to change, Alex.
"You can still make things right." Alex looked at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion she hadn't seen in him since he was a student. "I want to believe that," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "But I've done things I'm not proud of. I don't even know where to start."
Margaret led him to the couch, and they sat down. She spoke softly, her words filled with the compassion that had defined her career. "Start by acknowledging the people you've hurt.
Make amends where you can.
And remember that success is not just about what you achieve, it's about the legacy you leave behind, the lives you touch along the way." Alex nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor.
"I don't know if I can undo all the damage," he said, his voice barely audible.
Margaret smiled gently. "You may not be able to undo everything, but you can start moving in a different direction."
"You can still be the man you wanted to be, the one who makes a difference, who uses his success to uplift others."
There was silence between them, and then Alex looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something, a glimmer of the young boy she remembered, the one who had once dreamed of doing good in the world. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," he said quietly.
"For not giving up on me."
Margaret's eyes misted over, and she squeezed his hand.
"I never will, Alex. That's what teachers do. We believe in our students, even when they don't believe in themselves."
And in that moment, sitting in her cozy living room with the young man she had once taught, Margaret felt a sense of peace.
She knew that the journey ahead for Alex would be difficult, filled with challenges and hard decisions, but for the first time, she believed that he was willing to try.
And that was enough to know that her influence had mattered, that the ripples she had created all those years ago might still lead to something good. Profound ADJ, very deep or intense. Explanation, used to describe something that has a strong effect or is deeply meaningful. Example, his words had a profound impact on her life.
Instill verb, gradually but firmly establish an idea or attitude.
Explanation, to slowly introduce something into someone's mind or behavior. Example, the teacher aimed to instill values of kindness and honesty in her students.
Reconcile verb, to restore friendly relations or make peace.
Explanation, to bring into agreement or harmony, especially after a conflict.
Example, she couldn't reconcile his current behavior with the boy she once knew. Contemplate verb, to think deeply about something.
Explanation, to spend time considering a possible decision or thought. Example, Margaret sat by the window, contemplating whether she should attend the gala.
Resilient ADJ,
able to withstand or recover from difficult conditions. Explanation, sharing the ability to recover quickly from setbacks. Example, her students were taught to be resilient in the face of challenges. Daunting ADJ, seeming difficult to deal with in anticipation. Intimidating. Explanation, Describe something that makes you feel afraid or less confident. Example: the idea of confronting Alex at the gala was a daunting task for Margaret. Tarnish: verb to lose or cause to lose shine or value, often metaphorically related to reputation. Explanation: when someone's good reputation or character becomes damaged. Example: his unethical decisions began to tarnish his once bright reputation.
Philanthropy: noun, the desire to promote the welfare of others, typically through charitable donations.
Explanation: the act of giving money or time to help others. Example: Alex was involved in several acts of philanthropy, hosting charity events.
Did you enjoy Margaret's story and her journey to reconnect with Alex, her former student? Was the story easy to understand, and did it help you practice your English skills?
If you'd like to continue improving, I encourage you to watch more stories on our channel. Each one is crafted to help you grow in understanding new words and phrases.
A suggested video will appear at the end, so stay tuned and keep learning with us.
Remember, the more you listen, the better you'll get. Thank you for being here, and see you in the next story.